Let me talk a little bit about this whole issue of public violence being a public health emergency. And I have to tell you, I pushed back at her because as we looked at first the conference was about healthy alternatives. And so as we look at the health of urban residents, more particularly the health of African Americans and Latinos, primarily the residents of Irvington and urban cities around our state and around our nation. The state of health is challenging, whether it's childhood obesity that Mrs. Obama is taking on, whether it is high blood pressure, or cancer, all those things, those modalities that affect our people. That's one issue, because we certainly, by our lifestyles, contribute to that, but we also are challenged by the public response and the economy to that. And as a mayor, I'm always challenged about this particular subject because at the end of the day, while we have these discussions and we have to do what we must do to stem violence, we have to be very careful that we don't make our communities look like they're so overwrought that we kill investment, that we kill the potential of bringing jobs. And trust you, the urban landscape is where people need to come back to. And so we could get bamboozled. Not saying the crisis isn't real, but we could be getting bamboozled out of our landscape. We've invested our lives and our homes, our families, and so forth. So though we have tremendous challenges to work on, let us not scare away and even fool ourselves to devalue our urban landscape. So having laid that out to her, I'm going to take on the challenge of what is happening with violence, and I'm going to take it on from a number of perspectives. Number one, the call for violence being classified as a public health emergency is not new. In fact, many of you remember the genesis of a program called Ceasefire, which came out of the University of Chicago, and the professor who developed Ceasefire was a MD. And if I could get Herb to hand me, there's a few things that I left on my seat. It should be right on the top. The top things, yeah, the top papers. Thank you, Herbert. And one of the things he taught us, and even the poster, yeah, give me that and the poster, thank you. One of the things he said that he mentioned about looking at violence as a public health emergency was we had to attack it like a public health problem. And part of that prescription was we had to look at it, what did they do about reducing tobacco consumption? They actually ran a campaign to reduce tobacco consumption. And every health modality, whether it's strokes, diabetes, high blood pressure, they run a public campaign against those modalities. And so we looked at that, and then he developed out of that thought processes, the campaign also has to have extensions, and I think some of the other speakers earlier mentioned that are beyond just policing. And those extensions are, how do we get on the ground with this with people? So part of the Ceasefire initiative, and we implemented Ceasefire primarily, and it was a joint project between the city of Newark and Irvington. And we implemented that, I guess in my third year, fourth year as mayor. We got funding and we worked with the Police Institute at Rutgers in developing it. We got the people in from Chicago. We focused in on where crime was the most pressing in the East Ward of our city and at the Newark border. And Newark did a piece into that West Ward, Central Ward of the city. And we had this, we defined it as a ceasefire area. And every week, we met down at Rutgers and we looked at patterns of violence and what we must do. But part of that was we hired outreach workers, neighborhood people, who responded to families who were affected by violence or a victim of violence, and we went to those families, not as police officers, because the police investigation, all that has got to unfurl, but we went to those families to say, what could we do to assist you? And out of that process, we learned some things. Many of the families affected by that, there's almost a double crime being committed. They don't know about how to access victims' witness services. We also found out that cousin Johnny might want to respond and know stuff that he won't tell the police, but he might share it with the outreach worker. And then we're able to get in front of that and go talk to cousin Johnny to say, listen, you know, what happened to your cousin could happen to you if you respond like that. And then and even if you get what you think is revenge, you've now affected the family even more, because you're probably going to be facing a significant jail time when you get caught, and so forth and so on. So those kind of interventions, when I grew up, happened naturally in the community. Somebody could talk to the family and find out stuff, whether it was a pastor, whether it was just Miss Jones on the block who knew the family and knew what the boys were into, and we were able to quell those kinds. Now it's a little different. The strands of neighborhoods are slightly different, so we had to have outreach workers who became very familiar with the community in which they worked in and were able to intervene in ways that the police could not. And they were not snitches. They did community work, and we tactfully used that information to assist that family, but to quell violence in our neighborhood. And I heard in Newark there now, and I'm, you know, my birthplace, my hometown, I've been in Irvington the last 25 years. I'm still concerned with the challenges of violence that affect our city, because it's at our border, and crime is really regional. So what affects one city really does affect another. And so while we are working assiduously to keep at least our homicide rate and our violence rate down, we know we're significantly challenged by what is happening in our sister city in Newark. So we're definitely concerned about that. But what happened in that process of doing that, in that targeted area on the Irvington side, because we did a lot of other things with the schools and with our social service agency, Rutgers data. It's not Mayor Smith's data. It's not the police's data. It's independent corroborator of the data. Violence went down in that targeted area on the Irvington side 33%. On the Newark side of the ceasefire initiative, it went down 11%. Now, we tried to figure out ways why that happened, and some of the things were the other social service investments that we made, and we really believe our outreach workers were a little bit better organized than the Newark outreach workers. But nevertheless, I just heard not months ago that Newark is re-engaging what people forgot. We had already been ventured into ceasefire. Ceasefire is not new. It's been here, and we actually implemented it with Newark, and we wish them success in that effort. But that tells us something, because I want to use the analogy of what happened in our neighborhoods where we used to do that when I grew up 50 plus years ago, and the strands of the community are not the same, that we have to get government and other outside institutions to figure out how we do that kind of community building. And so let me just talk a little bit about the public campaign piece. One of the interesting things that I recently came across was I was in a conference in in Phoenix, where we had individuals from around the United States. And so for the taxpayers of Irvington, you didn't pay for it. The federal government actually sponsored me as part of an initiative that I'm involved with as chairman of the Urban Mayors, called Strengthening Families, which I think is really one of the baseline things we have to do to stem violence in our neighborhood. But one of the most exciting messages I saw was a group out of Philadelphia called the Father's Day Rally Committee. And Philadelphia is impinged by violence probably at a level that's even greater than our sister city, Newark. And they even had this recent occurrence of a mob, what do they call it, mob flashing, where people were, it's a new phenomenon that we see. And I'm sure it's a reaction to no economic opportunities, and many people say in Philadelphia is a result of a very aggressive policing to what people would call police brutality. So the gentleman who was there from the Father's Rally Day Committee, they had developed a campaign, and they began to just put this message out. Part of recognizing something as a public health emergency is, and I mentioned tobacco, I mentioned the health modalities, is they send out public messages that gets people to think without a whole lot of hullabaloo, but wow, people see that. Even kids will say, what does that mean? So this one is African American community health, and the target year is 2011, and it promotes a 5-stop program, and it encourages African Americans in particular to stop killing each other, stop hurting each other, stop stealing from each other, stop disrespecting each other, and stop being discourteous. But to promote the ABCs, you know, Michael Jackson would say ABC, easy as 1, 2. But promote the ABC, African Americans be courteous, because basic common, be courageous rather. Courteous is one of the ones later. Be courageous. We have to be brave enough as community leaders, as influencers, as parents, as pastors, as imams, as rabbis, to take on the challenge of what's going on in our neighborhood. It's not easy work. It was a different time. The difference in the time that I grew up in, adults could approach people, young and old, and there were some basic things that they didn't have to worry about. Today, we don't know. So the level of having some courage has to be ratcheted up. And I really think part of that courage has to come from men, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Be confident. You know, confidence means that we have the ability not to let our communities go down the tube, and certainly be competent. And that means whatever your skill level, whatever you do, let's bring that beyond what you have to make a living for. Let's bring that skill to the table to lift up our neighborhood. So if you're an educator and you're retired, and then Kathleen is doing that through the NAACP and her youth program, bringing her educational skills to the table. I heard her say she's working with our alumni association, but we have a bunch of retired educators out there that could give 2 hours a week, maybe if not in a school building, maybe in a church or a mosque or a community center. I got some buildings we would open up to allow you to do that. But bring that competency to the table to uplift our community. Be courteous. We used to take courtesy for granted. That certain things, men would open the door for women, would let them go first. Those basic things, some of our young people don't even know, because the family is really the purveyor of values. And I'm going to talk a little bit about values in a second, because I think that's part of why we have violence, and we have it as a public health concern. Be concerned. I think Herbert said, though the shooting didn't happen in my neighborhood, that doesn't mean that you could be driving through and the bullet could hit you. Or you could be going to the store and be the victim of something that you had nothing to do with. And even when the individuals who practice lawlessness die, we should be as concerned about that as when police brutality happens. And I think I heard Reverend Rutherford say this: the whole sense of community around, we got to be collective. We've really got to bring back, so we're going to be trying to promote this idea, get this up in stores, get this around schools, et cetera. So I think it's a good response, an initial response. And listen, you know, I've spent the most of my career in some form or another in sales and marketing. Advertising works. Trust me, billions of dollars would not be spent if those messages, those billboards, those ideas did not affect what you do. They study it, and they know it affects the way we buy, the way we think, the way we dress, the cars we want to ride in. So we have to be as combative as the advertising and marketing industry and those forces out there, whether it's negative hip-hop, because all hip-hop isn't negative, whether it's negative hip-hop or it's the gang culture that's promoting ideas that people are embracing and we don't have a combating force to and fight back with. When I grew up, it was the church. It was responsible elders in the community that had the counter message to the guys on the street that were trying to sell a negative. So right now, we're not. So we have to wage that war in messages, and that's why I appreciate Herb and what we are trying to do with TV 34 is with all the things you see on TV, the one thing that we have control of in our local government is our own media. And what we promote on that and what we say on that and what values we try to promote on that is critical to changing the thought patterns of our people. We just got to push them to watch it. So this whole idea of violence as a public health emergency is emerging as a grassroots issue The United Youth Council, led by Salam Ismail, has been calling on a campaign. September 24th, they're going to be in front of Elizabeth City Hall. They're asking the entire community from around the state to come out and be a part of that. I've worked with Salam for years. So now let's talk about what I think are some of the foundations. So, and again, as a mayor, I do believe that police do help. It's not the answer, the total answer, but the police do help. And so what you see happening in our state and urban neighborhoods, the political will, the pay for police is challenged on both fronts. The governor has indicated by not providing state aid to municipalities who are struggling. It's not just Irvington, it's Patterson, it's Newark, it's Jersey City, it's Camden. And so you've seen a lessening of police officers on the street. And I mean, I've had to play the budget game myself with, if you don't give the concessions, and we got to lay you off, but then I figure out a way to manipulate the budget to bring them back. So we've struggled with that. Other towns have not been as fortunate to bring their cops back through the budget process, but that's going to be a challenge for us as a community. So what does that mean? We also have, and towns I think need to look at that, particularly cities, is what the auxiliary police mean. Newark has a group of people called special police, and I think as taxpayers of this state, though we have a state police barracks in town that actually moved here as a result of people like Reverend Rutherford working with us when I first became mayor to encourage the state police to come here. The other issue is, as a community, as we talk about why violence occurs, and certainly lack of jobs, right now there are less African Americans, Latinos taking a state police exam than when Reverend Rutherford and them started the recruiting program years ago. We have to get back to that fight as well, because committed community residents make a difference when they're on the police force. The other issue I'd like to just mention, and I'm going to cover a few points and I'm going to take my seat, but I want to get all of these messages out because I think Herb presents a unique platform today to talk about this whole idea of violence, public health, and some of the issues that I think surround it. Until Newark appointed the young lady about a week or so ago, we had one African-American police chief in all of Essex County, and that was ours. Reverend Rutherford mentioned in his statement that individual rose from, we had to fight to be a police sergeant. He's the only African-American chief in Essex County until Newark appointed the young lady just the other day. For all this time, you got a significant African-American population in Essex County. How you end up with just one police chief for this period of time is a challenge for us as we address that issue of what kind of makeup law enforcement operations exist. So let me go back to basics, as Reverend Rutherford said, and so to some of the ideas that I think will work for us. So I talked about ceasefire. I believe that there's some value in us making sure that we promote messages, and we have to do that aggressively from the street, from the pulpit, from every forum that we have. We got to bombard our young people with messages and images and so forth that change their mind from this idea that they don't value themselves. And so let me talk a little bit about that. When I was in the conference in Phoenix, which was designed to lift up this idea that part of our problem as a community in a whole host of areas is that men have not stepped up significantly to be responsible fathers. It was called a National Fatherhood Conference that I went to. And so I think that's one of the challenges, that when young men don't have guidance, the street becomes their guidance. They don't go to any house of worship where they get a moral and a religious foundation of any type. So out of that discussion in Phoenix, and this was a multicultural conference, but certainly the African Americans clustered at lunch and at dinner, and out of informal conversations, everybody said, it seems like our community needs to have a discussion about values. What do we find most important? Because if we begin to value our individual selves, our neighborhoods, then some of the devastation would not take place. So the brother who was part of designing the poster that I showed you, Bilal Khayyam from Philadelphia, who, as I mentioned earlier, is confronted with a whole different level of violence, and because they're so close to Camden, it affects even what happens in Camden. we said, listen, why don't we begin a small group out of this conference that will move around the country to begin to have this discussion. Herb taped the first meeting because he asked me, would I be willing to host the first meeting in Irvington? And Herb, I guess it was about a week or so ago that we had that meeting in Irvington, and we had people come in from Philadelphia, we had people come in from New York, we had people come in from Washington, and we had a few local people here participate in this, what we're calling a series of roundtable discussions about a values-based movement. And the principle was, what fueled the civil rights movement? We're talking about celebrating the anniversary of the NAACP. We have a state convention coming up. Reverend Rutherford is a candidate for the presidency. What was the undergirth of the civil rights movement? It was a set of values and principles that drove people to be courageous enough to take on Jim Crow, to take on segregation, because they believed and valued themselves as a community of people, and they had a response to what was happening to them. And that meant organizing. So Du Bois and others, and well-meaning whites as well, joined in that to say, how do we change society? And whether it was the Brown Board of Education, whether it was looking at industries that were segregated and we couldn't get work. And by and large, that's happening now. In many places, America is more segregated now, and school districts are more segregated now than before Brown Board of Ed. And we're not having that discussion about an integrated society and what does that mean in terms of, so we have to have that value discussion again. What was the fuel behind the Black Power movement? What made Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X and even Elijah Muhammad, what made them courageous enough to take on at a time when no one was talking about black was beautiful, that we as a people have value, and would stand up unabashedly and create people like Muhammad Ali, say, I'm a bad son of a gun, and I can, and use that platform of his athleticism, not just to be what drove Kurt Flood to give up millions of dollars to take on the contracts in baseball and give up all that? What made Muhammad Ali give up all the money he could have made and buy? Could have went to the military, and he would have just been doing boxing expeditions. He wouldn't have been in a war. But what drove him to say, the money isn't important. My value as a human being, or my commitment to God or a higher purpose, is a value system. And so we have to, so this is what was the genesis of this conversation in Phoenix that we brought to Irvington. And so we would think one of the precursors to really getting back to stemming violence in our community is we've got to teach values to our people in a way that we've never done it before. And that's whether it's in a house of worship, because sometimes we take it for granted that even though our leadership in those houses of worship call us to God, there's a lifestyle that we've got to live to be in accordance with those principles. And so we've got to teach that in a way and make families. The second thing we began to talk about was family. And so we have all configurations of family. And so not just talking about the traditional family is going to work, but one of the values we have to re-promote is that traditional family, because young people don't come from traditional families. And let me tell you why, because it isn't founded on any just conservative religious principle. If you look at the data for black men in particular, married men live longer, and I think there's a reason for that. The wife would usually press you to take care of yourself. There's an economic interest. I was teasing my wife the other day. I said, marriage is one thing, but this is more like a merger. Every time I look up, I got to put more money in this to the shareholders. And so, but that's a principle. It's a value principle that we can do more together than we can apart. And so we have to get back. I remember growing up, and Pastor Rutherford, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that even in our houses of worship, you didn't date too long You know, if you were in the masjid, you had to have an escort. If you went out with a sister, somebody was going with you, they was going to watch you, and you may go to that dinner, and you're going to drop her off at that door and give her the greetings, and that's it. So we have to somehow go back, and you know, some people say it's corny, but if we've got a whole group of people that don't know, we used to have some standards of behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that people didn't do things that were not right, but we resisted that in a way that it affected the society. So even the proliferation of young teen pregnancy, when I grew up, when that happened, people in the community knew that maybe that's not the appropriate behavior. Or, and Rev, forgive me if I say shotgun wedding, somebody was getting married. If you grown enough to make a baby, you're gonna get a night job and go to school during the day, or you're gonna go to school at night and get a job during the day. And even if we have to take the child in our house, you're gonna do what you're supposed to do. And the community set a standard up. And the reason why I'm saying that is too many of our children are affected by poverty, and this whole discussion in Phoenix was about how do we begin to rebuild a cultural idea that we have to have some standards. And it's not an easy, it's a conversation that politicians usually don't engage in, but I know that there are a whole lot of things that government ain't gonna be able to do now, and unless we build a different kind of, what we're calling a values-based movement. The other thing I wanna mention is, some of our people use the economic times as an excuse for violence. And we realize that this is a tough time for everybody. Well, our parents lived through the Depression. They weren't out there killing everybody because they didn't have a job. They did do, because they valued themselves and they valued the idea of work of any type until they could do better. So you had educated men that were sleeping car porters because they had to earn a living until an opportunity, and that's why the NAACP worked to create lines of opportunity so that when those educated people got those opportunities, they went into them and then opened the doors for others. But you have to work somewhere. And so what we see is, because we're not valuing our landscape as a community, I see some things happening in the economy that are challenging for us as a community, and it's really the undergirth of why we have some of this and not economic. If we don't value who we are and value our own neighborhoods, we won't see the economic opportunities in it. And I don't begrudge them. As a mayor, I have to encourage it. But when I look around, when I grew up in Newark, when I went to the cleaners, I saw myself when I handed the clothes to the man and woman behind that counter. When I went to the neighborhood grocery store, I saw myself when I went to the neighborhood grocery store. Automatically in my head, I knew I could own a business. But if young people are not seeing that today, if they don't see those economic, if everybody else sees the opportunity in our neighborhood and we don't, and when our young people when they go to the corner store now, and I'm not begrudging the bodega, which is owned by mostly Latino business owners, or the Korean, who's selling us chicken and fish, and nobody can fry chicken and fish like our parents and our people. Or if the Arab is selling us the things that we built restaurants and neighborhood empires from, we have given that landscape away because we're not looking at the goal that's right here in our community. So it's about a sense of values. That whole idea of doing for self, of casting your buckets where you are very important to us. And then the last thing we talked about was, and I use my mother's expression to me growing up. She was not an educated woman, and especially when my mother and father separated, she would say to us, "You're gonna be looking at that book. I don't know if the book is upside down or not, but I know one thing, you're gonna sit here for these 2 hours, and if you're gonna fool me, you're gonna have your nose in that book." They valued education. My father would tell us that they knew more about black history without going to college because they read everything. And so we have to have a mission about educating ourselves. My parents were informed. They knew, because they read. Sunday was the Sunday paper day. They read from front to the back. They knew everything that we could talk about, current events, watch the news, made us watch the news. So we from our own home, family is the place where those values are calculated, and we've got to build a movement where we push this stuff. So here's what we want to do on the local level as around this particular issue, and I think it's going to make an impact as I close. On October 28th, I convened a group of men, some of them my employees and some of them outsiders, yesterday. Herb also taped some of our value-based discussion that we had, and that value-based discussion is going to become a national movement. We're moving the next meeting to Washington, D.C., and then after the Washington, D.C. meeting, we're going to go to Philly, and then we're trying to hook up with some people in the Midwest, Detroit or Chicago, and then we hope to go to the West Coast and then come back with a synthesis of information and a strategy. And the poster that you have is one that hits the violence issue right at the head to get us to really think, and hopefully we can develop a whole campaign around that. But on October 21st, there's been a national campaign called Dad, Take Your Kids to School Day. It's a clarion call to get men engaged in school. Now, what we did, we're going to modify the campaign because, you have to modify things to fit your neighborhood. So we're calling on the fathers who live in Irvington to do just that, to join us. And listen, if you got to go to work, don't stop them biscuits and chicken from getting on the table, go to work. But if grandfather can come, if cousin who's unemployed can come, give us that day to bring your kids to school. And we're actually going to work with the school district to see if we can do some things in the school that day, like reading to kids, talking to kids, and others. We're having a planning meeting at City Hall at 9 o'clock on September the 12th. We want to encourage churches to get involved and other religious organizations to get involved. I think we've got to look at our communities and create an environment for change. And we've got to be really aggressive about it. And that doesn't mean that we won't have internal debates with each other, because at mayors, people have disagreed, agreed, and you keep on working. As long as you're out there working, we can work together on the things that we can get together with that we have in common, and I'm committed to doing that. But Herbert, I thank you for this opportunity to at least share what I think are the roots of the problem, because unless we get to the root of the problem, we'll never cure what is making a person anywhere from 13 to 25 shoot somebody that could be their grandmother, that could be their mother, because some of the people don't even know their own parents. God bless you. Thank you very much.